Salutations, respected viewers. This is George from Ireland. Here I am, speaking to you from London, about the statue of Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi. Well, who was he? He should need no introduction. He was one of the most renowned campaigners of the 20th century, and indeed achieved success in some of his goals. So he was born in Gujarat, which is a state of India, in 1869. He was born in one of the princely states. So remember, at that time, there were something like 600 princely states. So India was a British colony. There was a system of diarchy. Some of the provinces directly ruled by the British Indian government. And in these princely states, there would be hereditary Indian rulers who would rule them according to their own mores. They would usually appoint a prime minister. There would often be a resident or agent. The resident, sometimes called agent, was a Britisher who was there to handle relations with the United Kingdom. So Gandhi, he was a Hindu, and he was one from one of the middling castes, Vedya, and he was from a highly educated and affluent family. So he came here to London in his youth to read for the bar, and indeed he qualified as a barrister. There's a blue plaque outside the house there where he lived, and he returned to India, practiced there for a while. So obviously he had an absolute command of English, but later he moved to South Africa, and Indians were moving to Africa in increasing numbers, and they were often working in technical jobs that Africans had not yet been trained to do. So there's that famous tale of Gandhi being chucked off the train. However, it's often been told in a deceitful manner. He objected to Indians being classified along with black people. So racist discrimination was in the law. And he said no, he approved of discrimination, but only against black people, not against Indians. He wanted Indians to be classed along with whites. Now, obviously there should be no racial discrimination at all, and we should not segregate people on railway carriages on the basis of colour or anything like that. So the long and the short of it is he had to leave first class. But it's not quite the way it's gone down. He's not quite as broad-minded or egalitarian as people now wish to pretend. And he was there during the Second South African War, 1899 to 1902, when the British Empire was battling against the Transvaal Republic and the Orange Free State, which had attacked them unprovoked. Yes, it's true, more British troops have been brought into South Africa in the months leading up to that. And obviously, the British Empire was absolutely entitled to move its troops within its own territory. It didn't have to ask permission, particularly from these two Afrikaner states, Transvaal, the Orange Free State, which had recognised British paramountcy. Anyway, and they attacked the British Empire. That was that. But he encouraged Indians to serve, to do what they could, because he felt this empire worked for the betterment of Indians. So he was unhappy about racial discrimination, not surprisingly, fingerprinting of Indians but not of other races in South Africa. And this way began to clash with the colonial authorities. But he would still urge his supporters to sing God Save the King, because he thought that despite the empire's flaws, it was still overall a force for good. Then the First World War came along. So much for his pacifism, he urged Indians to volunteer to fight for the defense of this empire, which he think was doing something for small nations. Well, India is certainly not small, but it was not as technologically advanced as the United Kingdom. Though it had been scientifically much more advanced in the UK if you go back centuries prior to that. Things like human rights and the abolition of slavery, they were around in India long before they're thought of in the Western world. So then after the First World War, he was expecting major reform. He wanted dominion status, India to have the same status as, say, Australia or Canada, to be internally self-governing, still part of the British Empire, relying on the UK for defence and foreign affairs. But no, the British government really didn't want to budge. They'd said, well, we'll think about it, giving these non-committal answers. And this wasn't good enough. So he's part of the Indian National Congress, found a way back in 1885, with the blessing of the British Raj, to provide a critical analysis of what the Raj was doing and to represent Indian public opinion, to suggest ways to ameliorate people's lives in India. But by the 1920s, it was oppositional. And then in 1919, that April, there was the Jallianwala Bagh massacre. So at Amritsar, at least 479 people were shot dead by Brigadier General Dyer. It's probably several times that figure, mostly unarmed people shot dead without warning. So this horrendous atrocity inflamed public opinion in India, as you can imagine, and Gandhi changed his tune. He was still into peaceful campaigning, and he condemned those who tried to use force to terminate the British Raj. And there were lots of hartalals, lots of strikes. He would often declare a fast unto death, which would never end in its death, but it would inflame tensions and would lead to the deaths of other people. What else? So the British government was playing cat and mouse with him, imprisoning him, letting him out, and him leading a civil disobedience campaign, the salt tax campaign. There was a tax on salt, which he said was pernicious and deliberately evaporating seawater to create salt, a crime. But the viceroy at the time, the Earl of Halifax, made sure there was no police officer within a mile of him, didn't want to give Gandhi what he wanted and arrest him. Gandhi would always refuse to pay fines, wanting to provoke the authorities and having to incarcerate him. So anyway, 1935, finally an agreement had been hammered out. There had been various roundtable talks here in London. He'd come here, he'd stayed at Balliol College, Oxford, he'd stayed at Eton and so on. And that's when diarchy went a bit further, and the situation actually calmed down in the late 1930s. Congress ruling a few provinces, and the Muslim League ruling a few provinces. The Muslim League hadn't come up with a Pakistan demand by that time. Ulema, Muhammad Iqbal, and others, they had this embryonic notion of a separate homeland for Muslims, not necessarily to completely break away from India. But then the First World War broke out. Now, by that stage, Gandhi was getting on, and it handed over leadership of Congress to his right-hand man, Nehru. The Viceroy, Lord Linlithgow, he declared war on behalf of India, declared war on Germany. Now, the Congress administration said, well, you didn't even consult us, as he wasn't actually required to do, but they felt it was not on that India would be at war, despite not a single Indian even having been asked about it. So they said, well, no way. They all resigned in October 1939, all the Congress administrations in the provinces, but the Muslim League ones did not. The Muslim League was much more cooperative with the British Raj, and perhaps that's one of the reasons they got Pakistan. So Gandhi, he'd long spoken out against Japanese aggression, but thought that India should do nothing about it. He denounced fascism and all the rest of it. But later he was saying that the United Kingdom should just capitulate to the Third Reich, because that would be somehow a morally superior thing to do. But when the Japanese attacked in 1941, and then they indeed occupied some Indian territory, he thought that lathi play and the like should be practiced, as though a wooden stick would be enough to hold back a Japanese mechanized division. So he was very otherworldly, very unrealistic, against modern medicine, saying it was effeminate, it involved spirituous liquor and things like that, and hospitals were bad, injections were violent. So he was a kook in some regards, had lots of half-baked ideas. Anyway, it wasn't just a crank, there were good things. By this stage, he really was into racial equality. He did everything he could to promote fraternity between people of different faiths. So he was a very erudite man, but he had his flaws. And he was known for his indefatigable advocacy of the rights of the untouchables, as they were called, or children of God, as he would say, Harijans, Dalits, some people used to call them opprobriously. And so some people were very bigoted towards those of the scheduled castes. And he said, no, this is monstrous. This sort of discrimination is worse than anything that the Britishers have done to us. So there was a Quit India movement from 1942 onwards, and that gave the Raj quite a headache, people deliberately sabotaging railways. The Bengal famine was going on at this time, and of course Congress sabotaging the railways only exacerbated this. And Congress, I suppose, should have prioritised saving the lives of their countrymen in Bengal rather than making life difficult for the British Raj. Though Nehru did say, if you grant us immediate independence, we will declare war on the Axis. But the British authorities did not trust Congress to do that, certainly not to fight vigorously. Having declared war, then obviously an independent Indian government could make peace at any time, on any terms. So that was that. Anyway, the war finally came to an end, and it was agreed. Stafford Cripps had been to India in 1942, and he said, yes, we will facilitate independence as soon as possible. A blank check drawn on a failing bank was how Gandhi described it. And of course, the Allies could easily have lost the Second World War. So then, after the war, Lord Wavell was Viceroy, formerly headed the Indian Army, but it was felt that they needed someone else with a bit more stage presence. a new man to come in, and that's why in March 1947, Viscount Mountbatten of Burma arrived out, who'd been the Supreme Allied Commander in South Asia in the in the Second World War. Who then he was trying to get this right, a second cousin of King George VI, great grandson of Queen Victoria. So he knew India quite well. He toured it with Edward VIII, when Edward VIII, Prince of Wales, in 1920, and had then talked about filthy non-cooperators, and he had loathed Congress. However, by 1947, Mountbatten's views had matured. By the late 30s, he recognised that Congress represented India's future. So despite being from, well, a scion of a royal house, he had some left-wing and liberal leanings. And he was certainly a breath of fresh air. In the biopic of Lord Mountbatten, they have the Nehru character, played by Richardson, saying, at least he's not another stuffed shirt. But anyway, Gandhi really did not want to see the partition of India, but it was unavoidable. So Congress did actually vote for it. Gandhi wasn't in the Indian Parliament by that time. So there was terrible bloodshed in 1947 at the time of partition. But Gandhi decided he would achieve reconciliation. He was going to go to Pakistan on a conciliatory visit. And so some Hindu ultranationalists found this to be unacceptable. And some fanatics of the, I'm trying to say this correctly, Rashtriya Swayamsev Sevak Sangh, like the National Volunteer Movement, decided that he had to be bumped off. So he was staying at that house, oh my goodness, I've been to it, I've forgotten what it's called, named after the wealthy industrialist who funded it in Delhi, where he'd go for his daily prayer meeting, and Narayan Apte and Nathuram Godse decided to assassinate him. They bought a firearm, they went up to him, one of them gave him a namaste, and the other pulled the trigger and fired several bullets into his chest. In a museum in Delhi, you can still see the gun that killed him, and his last words were, "Hey Ram." He was cremated the next day, and there in the front row was Viscount Mountbatten. So you see the very memorable biopic from 1981, made by that British director who's very sympathetic to Congress, Richard Attenborough. Next thing, or Lord Attenborough I could call him, as he later was. So the two men who killed him, they were sentenced to death, but they were absolutely convinced they wouldn't be executed. And Gandhi's sons, being non-violent, they campaigned zealously for a reprieve for their father's assassins. But it wasn't to be. Viscount Mountbatten was Governor General of India. Remember, it was not a monarchy till it was a monarchy until 1950. He said there was no case for exercising the royal prerogative of mercy. They must be executed as provided for by the Indian Penal Code. But the assassins were absolutely certain that they would not be executed. One of them had read it on the palm of his hand, believed in palmistry, the long lifeline, and when the hangman came to the door of his cell, he fainted. He couldn't believe it, that his palm had let him down, and they were topped. Well, there's Gandhi. So an absolutely scintillating and world historical figure.